So, the story of the first explorers of the Olmecs is one of the greatest stories of discovery and exploration around a truly lost ancient civilization that is never told. I just returned home from my 4th expedition to the Olmec world, and in fact, the very first ancient megalith I ever saw was the largest head discovered at the site of La Venta. I was immediately captivated. The Olmecs had risen, reached their peak, and fallen before the rest of ancient America had really even begun. It's possible that the Aztecs, who rose nearly 3,000 years after the Olmecs, never even knew the Olmecs had existed. We have no idea what the Olmecs called themselves, what language they spoke, how their society worked, how their religion worked, or even the total impact they had on later ancient civilizations of Mexico. The Olmecs are a truly lost civilization. And from that day on, I've been captivated by everything involving the Olmec world. And it was definitely captivating to the first explorers. My name's Luke Caverns, I'm an American explorer, and I come from a lineage of explorers who searched for lost Spanish treasure and ancient artifacts in the American Southwest dating back to the 1890s. And this is the first explorers. There were no headlines written about the discovery of the very first Olmec head. Nobody even seems to know the exact day in 1862 that it was found. It wasn't a treasure trove of Maya jade or a cache of Aztec gold. It was a colossal basalt head staring eternally off toward the horizon that had been found in the fields of Tres Zapotes by the Mexican explorer Jose Maria Melgar y Serrano. He published his findings in 1869 and described the facial features to be African. As a work of art it is, without exaggeration, a magnificent sculpture, but what astonished me most was the Ethiopian type it represents. I thought that without doubt there had been Negroes in this country, and that in the earliest ages of the world. While the locals around central Mexico had perhaps known of these ancient monuments popping up in the fields and being found in the forests, because of their lack of riches, the interest never really carried back to Mexico City, let alone other archaeological institutions in New York City or London. And so the head sat there in the fields of Tres Zapotes, half uncovered and untouched, for another 69 years. The story of the Olmec's first explorers is one of the most incredible and heroic stories that is never told, with some of the greatest explorers that nobody has ever heard of. And in fact, this may be the only video that's ever been made telling this story.
So have you ever found out that you were being charged for a streaming subscription that you had totally forgotten about, or you subscribe to some channel to watch a show, the show ends, and you just completely forget to unsubscribe, and the company basically makes it impossible to unsubscribe? Well, that's happened to me, that's happened to you, that happens to everybody. But luckily for you, I teamed up with today's sponsor, Rocket Money, to finally find a solution to this problem. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that lets you manage subscriptions, lower bills, create a custom budget, and grow your savings all in one place. Rocket Money is absolutely the best thing that you can use to identify your unwanted subscriptions. It automatically scans and lists every recurring charge so I can see everything clearly in one place. With just a few taps, I canceled a streaming service that I didn't even know I was subscribed to. I also used it to set up a custom budget in seconds. It shows exactly where my money is going, highlights my top spending categories, and sends alerts for upcoming bills or low balances so I never get hit with overdraft fees. And for savings, Rocket Money analyzes my spending and helps automate transfers to reach my goals faster. I just pick the goal frequency and it handles the rest. Rocket Money members have saved in a total of over $880 million in canceled subscriptions. Take control of your finances today. To save more and spend less, join the over 10 million members using Rocket Money. Scan the QR code or click the link in the description to get started for free. And you can also unlock even more features with Premium. Thank you to Rocket Money for sponsoring this video. Now I'm gonna get back inside and you can get back to the show.
In 1924, the University of Tulane organized their very own Department of Middle American Research and organized the first Tulane expedition to explore Chiapas, Tabasco, and Veracruz, Mexico, just a short boat ride south from New Orleans. The purpose of the expedition was to discover and document uncharted Maya sites, ruins, and monuments, collect artifacts and data, and produce scholarly publications to build the university's reputation in Middle American archaeology. Needless to say, the fact that we're talking about it today, this worked. And at the head of this expedition is one of the greatest explorers of all time. who almost nobody has ever heard of before: the great and restless Frans Blom. Personally, Frans Blom, like Percy Fawcett, is a hero of mine. He's an explorer that I resonate a lot with. At 32 years old, he was the perfect man to lead this precarious expedition into the remote heart of central Mexico that was just recovering from the devastation of the Mexican Revolution. Blom grew up in Denmark as an adventurous kid and an indifferent student, flunking many of his classes, dropping out of his art and philosophy classes, and constantly being in a state of wanderlust. Something out there far away was calling to him from a young age. That calling made him restless. By his mid-20s, his family cut him off and encouraged him to buy a one-way ticket to the Americas in 1919. He found work in Mexico's booming oil industry as a mapper and surveyor in the remote areas of Veracruz, Tabasco, and Chiapas. And it was in these jungles that Blom would come face to face with the silent ruins of a lost world. And it was here that he found what had been calling to him since he was a child. And although he didn't realize it yet, this was the reason he'd come to the Americas. He became disillusioned with the oil field surveys and had started returning back to the ancient sites he was finding in his free time to explore, sketch, and document the ruins. He kept detailed journals of his discoveries, and although it is not known how this meeting took place, Blom's work eventually made its way in front of a Maya archaeologist named Sylvanus Morley, who would quickly become a mentor for Blom. After contracting malaria in 1922, Blom left the oil industry and decided to pursue Maya archaeology full-time. It was his mentor through his connections that was able to arrange Blom's acceptance into Harvard University to study and train in archaeology for 2 semesters between 1923 and 1924. Through word of mouth, Tulane's new Middle American department saw Frans Blom as the youngest, fittest, and most experienced possible leader of the expedition, and his employment as a field explorer and archaeologist for Tulane University began on January 1st, 1925. On February 19th, Blom boarded the United Fruit Company steamship and departed from New Orleans across the Gulf of Mexico and made port in Veracruz sometime in early March. Although this scientific expedition was done in cooperation with the American University and the Mexican government, the law couldn't protect Blom from the remote corners of this country, where bandidos, who are leftover rebels from the revolution in the decade before, were still hiding out in the remote farmland and jungles, and didn't take kindly to unwanted visitors. Blom would have to negotiate or evade these encounters to survive, and the environment could kill as well. Most of the expedition would require Blom to wade through swamps, marshy islands, flooded plains, dense wetlands, and precarious volcanic mountainsides, all pelted with heavy rains, thick humid air, and the scorching Mexican sun, filled with mosquitoes which carry malaria, deadly insects, jaguars, crocodiles, and the America's deadliest snake, the fertile ants. The expedition would be carried out on foot, by boat, and on horseback, all of which present their own risks. From the city of Veracruz, they traveled south by train and then by horseback until they reached the pass into the mountainous Tuxtla region, a volcanic, rugged, forested mountain range that explorers would later come to realize was the prime quarry site for this lost civilization. Jumping off horseback and narrowly avoiding bandits hiding in the lawless wilderness, Blom cut his way with a machete through the thick vegetation up the side of the dormant volcano known as San Martin Pajapan. And it was near the top of the mountain he discovered, covered in forested overgrowth, a mysterious statue of a kneeling figure with features unlike anything he'd seen before. This is the first recorded discovery of an isolated Olmec monument outside of an Olmec city. Though Blom didn't know who the Olmecs were or that this monument was created by a civilization even older than the Maya, it was obvious that this statue had been deliberately brought to this location on the mountainside for a specific reason that was lost to time. For Olmec explorers like myself, this discovery is particularly interesting because it's an enormous statue hauled to the top of a volcano, away from any known Olmec city or settlement, which means that there must be more of these monuments placed on mountainsides in the unexplored corners of the Olmec realm. Blom's expedition headed further east into Tabasco, Mexico, traveling by boat along the long river stretches, by horseback in the drier regions, and then wading through chest-high waters in the insect-ridden swampy regions. And like some of you guys may remember from the First Explorers of Machu Picchu episode, where Hiram Bingham traveled along the Urubamba asking locals about the location of unvisited ruins, everywhere Blom went, he asked locals of ancient ruins they may have known of. However, in the Olmec realm, this can be especially tricky and hard to determine without completely excavating a site. Just a few weeks ago, I saw a collection of enormous hills south of the Olmec capital city of San Lorenzo that looked to be almost certainly Olmec pyramids, but more than 3,000 years of erosion has buried these structures to an almost unrecognizable point, especially if the forest has grown over them. Blom was brought to an enormous site that didn't seem to fit any known ancient culture. It was different from the art styles of El Tajín to its west, and it was different from the art styles of the Maya to the east. The archaeological site was named after the modern settlement nearby, which was called La Venta. It was here that Blom made his most significant Olmec discovery, La Venta Monument 1. And this is the exact colossal head that I saw on my first expedition to the Olmec realm. It was partially buried near La Venta's Great Pyramid, an enormous structure made up of over 200,000 tons of earthen fill, an absolutely enormous monument, and is often considered to be North America's oldest pyramid, although there may be some pyramids in the modern US that are much older. Recent studies on the pyramid have shown there to be a void in the center of the pyramid, potentially a burial chamber or some other kind of offering, as well as buried stone staircases lining each of the four sides of the pyramid. Hopefully someday the pyramid will be fully investigated. Also discovered were several megalithic altar stones, a monument depicting a traveler, whom I think might just be an ancient visitor from the Mediterranean, but I digress. A monument bearing the oldest depiction of the feathered serpent in known history, and thousands of tons of basalt columns, and 5 mysteriously buried caches of serpentine stone arranged in detailed patterns. All of these materials were imported from 100 to 200 kilometers away, from the volcanic Tuxtla Mountains in the west, and deep from within the Maya jungles of modern-day Guatemala to the east. It's clear that whoever built this site, procured these materials, and erected and carved these monuments was a powerful ancient civilization that didn't seem to fit into any known timeline. They came from a time before known history. Blom's expedition took him even further south, down into Chiapas, where he entered the western gem of the Maya world, Palenque. He documented many more unknown ruins and brought back to the US some of the most iconic photos ever taken of the lost cities hidden in the middle of the American jungles. But when Frans Blom left the Olmec world for the jungle ruins of the Maya, it would be another decade before the Olmec's greatest explorer would arrive to explore this primordial land. The Olmec's greatest explorer was born on August 28, 1896 in Salinas, California. His name was Matthew Stirling. He grew up on his grandfather's ranch in Salinas Valley, where he developed a curiosity for the ancient world by exploring the creek beds and collecting arrowheads. His grandfather fueled his interest and sparked a lifelong obsession with piecing together the ancient world of the Americas. After high school, he attended college at the University of California at Berkeley, where he studied anthropology and began training to be an ethnologist. Now, because of films like Indiana Jones, we often think of these great explorers of the ancient world as being solely archaeologists. They seem to go hand in hand. But as we've seen in this first Explorer series, that isn't exactly always the case. However, Stirling's studies were interrupted. A great war had been raging in Europe for the last 3 years, and in April of 1917, it had finally pulled in the United States. At 21 years old, Stirling was enlisted as a junior officer aboard a U.S. naval ship patrolling the waters of the Atlantic, protecting supply ships and scanning for German U-boats. It's not known if he saw combat, nor is it known what ship he served on, but it is likely that he experienced anti-sub engagements during his 2 years of service in the Atlantic from 1917 to 1919. He was honorably discharged and returned to California to complete his final year. During that last year before graduating in 1920, he encountered a photograph of a small ancient jade statue depicting what seemed to be a crying baby with facial features that are mixed with a jaguar. And for Olmec fans who have seen my other videos, you know exactly what this is. But in 1920, nobody had any idea of what this little jaguar baby was, where it had really come from, or who created it. But something about staring into the little blue jade figure, its fiery brows, feline eyes, and downturned lips, it ignited a curiosity in Stirling. He saw that this figure was unlike anything else in the known archaeological record. But again, nobody really knew where artifacts like this were coming out of Mexico, and there was no real opportunity to explore where it had come from. After graduation, Stirling found work as a museum aide at the Smithsonian from 1921 to 1924 in Washington, D.C. where he helped procure artifacts for the museum while earning a master's degree in ethnology. During this time, he went on several expeditions, performing surveys among the native tribes of California and attempting to piece together their ancient past. Later in 1924, driven by the wanderlust of the cultures of the ancient world, Stirling would temporarily resign from his post at the Smithsonian to embark on a personal journey with his best friend to South America, visiting countries like Peru and Bolivia and possibly even Ecuador as well. Nothing was officially published about this journey, but the expedition exposed him to a world far distant from his own, as well as the rugged terrain that is to be expected when embarking upon great expeditions to uncharted, ancient, or rarely visited corners of the world. The next year, Stirling would embark upon his first major expedition, requiring him to be gone for 2 years. Sponsored by the Smithsonian, Matthew Stirling and the expedition crew set off for Papua New Guinea in 1925 on what would be known as the American-Dutch Expedition to Dutch New Guinea. After nearly 2 months at sea, the expedition arrived on the shores of Papua New Guinea with a mission to document uncontacted indigenous tribes, document their ways of life, customs, and religion, collect artifacts such as tools, weapons, art, and iconography, and conduct anthropological surveys of the indigenous societies located deep in the jungles of the island's remote interior. They cut their way with machetes deep into the interior regions of the island, navigating the dense jungles, rivers, and mountainous terrain, all on foot. Papua New Guinea is still one of the most unexplored regions on Earth. The island is filled with unknown and unnamed diseases with effects similar to malaria, but sometimes more significant. It is filled with hostile wildlife and cannibalistic, uncontacted tribes that don't take kindly to outsiders. After 2 years of exploring the island and surviving an onslaught of complications, Stirling's team conducted one of the most successful and dangerous expeditions ever conducted on Papua New Guinea. At 31 years old in 1927, with a worn machete in hand, Matthew Stirling emerged from the island jungles of Papua New Guinea as a seasoned, experienced, and competent leader and explorer of the unmapped and unknown world. Over the next several years, Stirling would categorize and comb over the data gathered from his expedition, as well as continuing his other duties at the Smithsonian while planning his next great expedition. And during this time, Matthew would meet someone who he would credit as his co-author and general coordinator for the rest of his life. A beautiful secretary named Marion, who graduated the year before with a Bachelor's of Science, had been hired by the Smithsonian to assist Stirling with administrative duties. Looking back, her outgoing and enthusiastic personality was likely not only the reason Stirling fell head over heels for her, but quite possibly the very reason she got the job working in the ethnology department in the first place. As she revealed years later, she had to quote-unquote look up the definition of ethnology in a dictionary after getting the job. But she was sharp, charming, enthusiastic, and would become the love of Stirling's life. Their professional relationship soon turned personal, and over the next 2 years, they would do much more together than just clerical museum work. So here Matthew Stirling is, a 33-year-old, physically fit, field-hardened explorer with a high-ranking job at the Smithsonian while taking home the most beautiful and charismatic woman in the office. You can see why I like the guy. His next expedition in 1932 would take him away from Marion for nearly a year while he descended down into the dense, insect-ridden, and treacherous Amazonian jungles of eastern Ecuador to live amongst the Jivaro tribes, famous for their savage warriors and practice of shrinking heads. He documented their customs, ways of life, religious practices, how they conducted tribal warfare, and how they managed to shrink the heads of other tribal warriors they killed, all without himself being killed or having his own head shrunken and worn around the waist of an Amazonian warrior. No doubt, I'm sure he was looking forward to getting back to Marion. They were married almost immediately upon his return to the U.S. in 1933 and promptly went on an adventurous honeymoon expedition to Florida, where they visited numerous native Floridian archaeological sites and studied Florida's native cultures. There, sponsored by the Smithsonian, the Stirlings would spend the next 4 years overseeing the exploration surveys, excavations, and documentation of ancient sites around Florida, as well as extending up to Macon, Georgia. All while his wife Marion, graduated from her secretary duties at the Smithsonian, was his right-hand man in every way, often looking over the data he gathered in the field, studying, organizing, and interpreting it. Little did she know that her training in analyzing excavated artifacts would help her make one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in all of the Americas. But we'll get to that soon enough. In 1938, the inseparable couple took their first field trip to Mexico together. It was intended to be a relaxing vacation, as Marion was now pregnant with their first child, but naturally evolved into taking sketchy riverboats and untrustworthy taxis across South Mexico's bumpy and muddy backcountry to finally check out the region in which that strange jade jaguar baby figure that Sterling had seen in a photo back in college had supposedly come from. And as all great explorers have done, Sterling started asking around about ancient monuments and ancient sites that the locals had seen or heard of before, and eventually caught wind of a giant head sitting half buried in a field outside the village of Tres Zapotes. This was the same colossal head that Jose Maria had seen in 1862, and now in 1938, finally, another explorer had come to see it. One of the main reasons that the Olmecs were never seen nor discovered until just the last 100 years is because of the remoteness of their heartland. Even in 1938, there were no proper roads that you could use to drive into Tres Zapotes. Only muddy and unmaintained wagon and horseback paths could get you there. And so, leaving Marion to stay behind at a hacienda in Tlacotalpan, Sterling set off on an 8-hour horseback ride crossing the rivers, low swamps, and bogs of remote Veracruz. Nothing is known about what else Sterling saw around Tres Zapotes during this initial visit, but along with the colossal head, he must have seen the enormous earthen mounds which made up the vast ancient city that can still be seen today, as muddy and wet as it must have been during Sterling's time as well. As the mysterious colossal head lay half buried, staring off into eternity, it captivated Sterling's imagination. He returned home and was immediately able to convince the Smithsonian and National Geographic to sponsor a real expedition to investigate not only the site of Tres Zapotes, but also the other unvisited large sites in the region, provided this first excavation goes well. The first official Olmec expedition in history was launched in December of 1938, just 88 years ago. It's important to remember that even at this time, nobody was sure of who made the colossal head or the earthen mounds nearby. Most assumed they were Western, later Maya, and largely dismissed the sites, assuming they were of lesser importance. But Sterling had a hunch that there was something more here, but even he had no idea was awaiting him, nor that he, at 42 years old, was about to become unquestionably the greatest Olmec explorer of all time. Again facing sketchy riverboats, chopping their way with machetes through dense jungle trails, and riding on horseback, the expedition had arrived in Tres Zapotes. The goal was to excavate and investigate the large mounds, perform surface investigations like surveying for stone tools, stone fragments, and pottery laying around on the ground, and to finally reveal the entirety of the colossal head laying half buried in the middle of the field. By spring, they had mapped out the entire ancient city with its numerous pyramids, collected loads of pottery, discovered what seemed to be one half of a stela containing markings that seemed to be similar to the bar and dot dating system that's found throughout Mesoamerica, and especially in the Maya world. This artifact in particular fascinated Marion and would lead to her making one of the greatest discoveries in the history of American archaeology. The crew also fully unearthed the original mysterious colossal head and even found a second head nearby. By the spring of 1939, the first Olmec expedition was coming to an end, but Sterling knew he was hot on the trail of more great discoveries. Later in the same year, Expedition II would shift focus to another site which seemed to bear similar features and monuments as Tres Zapotes, La Venta, the very same city which Frans Blom had come across some 15 years earlier. And it would begin here that Matthew Sterling would become one of the most prolific discoverers in history. Yet again, cutting his way with machetes through the dense jungle, enduring the heat, pelting rain, and disease hovering over the expedition's crew, they would explore, map, and investigate the site for a year, revealing some of the most iconic images of the Olmec world. At the heart of the city lies an enormous earthen pyramid comprised of over 200,000 tons of packed earth, and at the base of the pyramid, sticking halfway out of the ground, like the colossal head that Jose Maria had found all those years earlier, Sterling had found yet another colossal head at a different ancient city. After cutting back the jungle foliage, was found 3 megalithic altar stones, and finally Sterling had come face to face with the were-jaguar he'd seen in photos decades before while he was just a young college student. The altar thrones, like all other Olmec monuments he discovered, were carved out of fine-grained, very hard and heavy basalt, which had been transported over 90 kilometers from the Sierra de la Tuxtla volcanic belt through a means and mechanism by which even today is still unknown. The altar thrones were scenes, essentially snapshots of actual events that took place in this ancient civilization. They depicted mysterious jaguar people emerging from caves, either harnessing long cords stretched out across the ground or carrying babies, who also possessed the human jaguar features, out of the cave. And what's happening in these scenes and how the were-jaguar cult functions in the Olmec society is something that I've been researching and exploring for several years now. So if you'd like to see me make a video breaking down what I've discovered about that, leave a comment in the comment section below. Stirling's second expedition was a huge success, and it seemed like no matter where Stirling's machete led him, he was bound to find more evidence of this strange lost civilization. By 1941, Expedition III was underway, and the Stirlings, along with their expedition crew, was headed back into the Olmec heartland to continue the investigations at La Venta. World War II was raging at this point and caused drastic supply shortages for the expedition. And while that was discouraging at first, nobody had any idea that this would be the most successful Olmec expedition thus far. Stirling's party cleared most of the archaeological site as the jungle had grown back thick in the last year. And over the next 2 years, they discovered 3 more colossal heads, 4 additional megalithic altar thrones, 4 megalithic stelae at the base of the Great Pyramid facing inward towards the city's central plaza, and 2 enormous offering caches containing 30 layers of buried serpentine mosaics weighing over 1,000 tons per cache. It was clear that Stirling's team had fully uncovered significant evidence of an ancient lost civilization that didn't fit anywhere within the understood timeline of the ancient Americas. Nobody would have guessed that the reason that you couldn't see the influence from the Olmecs was because the Olmecs had risen and fell far earlier. By the time the Maya had really begun to emerge with great power around 200 BC, the Olmecs had reached their height over 1,000 years earlier. But Stirling hadn't quite figured that out yet. He had a hunch that they might be Mesoamerica's oldest civilization, but still, he had to find the origins of this civilization. After all he discovered, Stirling's greatest expedition was still in front of him. But there were many, and I mean many, skeptics of the Stirling's work on the Olmecs, especially the idea that they were of early antiquity. Up to this point, the Maya reigned supreme. They were seen as the most sophisticated and oldest civilization in Mesoamerica. Archaeological giants like J. Eric Thompson and Sylvanus Morley, who, yes, was the mentor of Frans Blom, spent their entire careers studying the Maya world and were immediately and viciously opposed to the idea that the Stirlings had come along and discovered a civilization that completely uprooted the understood timeline of the Americas. One thing in particular they opposed was Marion Stirling's estimate that the broken half of the stela they discovered years before at Tres Zapotes, I told you this would be important to remember, contained a broken date that placed the stela precisely at 32 BC. Marion analyzed the surviving half of the date, calculated it according to her understanding of the Mesoamerican bar and dot numbering system, and estimated that if the other half of the stela were ever found, it would prove that the stela was erected in 32 BC. And if she were proven correct, it would mean that writing, dating, possibly the science of astronomy itself, was not born in the Maya world, but instead was given to the Maya by an even older culture, the Olmecs. Marion Stirling was viciously scrutinized and attacked for this claim. She was accused of her work being sloppy, ill-thought, and misunderstanding the basic premises of Mesoamerican chronology, numerology, and dating methods. At the earliest, most Mesoamerican scholars placed the Olmecs somewhere around 400 AD or even later, possibly sometime after 1000 AD. They said that the Olmecs were simply just another one of the numerous and ephemeral cultures of Mesoamerica that rose and fell in the background, while the heavy-hitting cultures like the Zapotecs, Teotihuacan, and the Maya marched through the centuries. The Stirlings returned home to spend time with their children and to focus on administrative duties at the Smithsonian for the rest of World War II, as the funding for archaeological expeditions had run dry. As the next 2 years went by, Matthew was itching to get back in the field and find the origins of this mysterious civilization. Fortunately, Hitler had become the second warlord to fail to invade Russia during the winter. Berlin finally fell, the United States won the atomic war, and successfully delivered the sun to Japan. Twice. The United States benefited immensely from winning World War II. The American economy was booming, funding for new projects was practically falling out of the ears, and most people probably don't even know that the economic success from coming out on top of World War II also allowed us to uncover the world's sixth cradle of civilization. Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, the Indus Valley, ancient China, Peru, and soon, Stirling would find his way to the next great cradle of civilization, the most successful and paradigm-shifting expedition of his career. The final expedition set off from Washington, D.C. in late January 1946. They took the long journey by train all the way down to Mexico City, traveled by car until they reached the Coatzacoalcos River, where they traveled by boat and then mule and horseback until they reached a town called Tenochtitlan, which had been settled by the Aztecs at the time of Spanish contact just 400 years before. It was here that the Stirlings had heard rumors over the years of unusually large mounds, terraces, and buried pyramids sitting undisturbed far off in the fields from the village. So yet again, with a machete in hand, the 50-year-old Matthew Stirling set off on not only the most successful expedition of his career, but one of the most successful, important, and paradigm-shifting expeditions of all time. He led his crew of 20 to 30 members over the rolling hills of the remote swamp and jungle lands of Veracruz, cutting their way through the vegetation, crossing snake-ridden streams, battling malaria and interactions with wildlife to a site now known as San Lorenzo. They set up camp and began mapping out the perimeters of the enormous ancient site. Indeed, these were terraces, rectangular plazas, pyramids, and long-range structures that had been buried by an untold amount of centuries. Surface finds around the enormous buried city showed what seemed to be early iterations of the pottery styles seen at La Venta, indicating to Stirling that this site may have been the formative place for the Olmec world. Heavy rain showers and flooding made the work slow at first, but soon enough Stirling would uncover the first large monument of the site. As you enter San Lorenzo today, you would absolutely never know, if you hadn't known prior, that this was the world's sixth cradle of civilization. It sits on an elevated plateau overlooking the river valleys below, which actually looks so much like the fertile and green river valleys of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley, which makes sense. To enter the site, you push open a rickety wooden cattle guard fence and walk into a cow pasture filled with ancient ruins that look like nothing more than small, unassuming rolling hills. Near the entrance is a small crater in the soft ground about 4 to 5 feet deep. That crater is the remaining evidence of Matthew Stirling's first major find and dig at San Lorenzo. It was here that the 30-ton colossal head known today as El Rey was discovered. As they dug down to reveal the colossal face staring eternally emerging from the ground, he knew that he had once again struck gold, or in this case, basalt. The next 8 weeks would be one of, or perhaps the most prolific run of archaeological discovery in all of history. By the end of the fourth expedition in April 1946, Matthew Stirling had uncovered over 200 more basalt monuments and statues from San Lorenzo, including San Lorenzo Colossal Head 1, Colossal Head 2, Colossal Head 3, Colossal Head 4, Colossal Head 5, Colossal Head 6, Colossal Head 7, Colossal Head 8, Colossal Head 9, and Colossal Head 10, as well as monuments 1 through 61, ranging from megalithic altar thrones to statues, circular altars, stelae, and much, much more. Present archaeological evidence indicates that their culture, which in many respects reached a high level, is very early and may well be the basic civilization out of which developed such high art centers as those of the Maya, Zapotecs, Toltecs, and Totonacs. This was undeniably the crown jewel of the Olmec realm. The earliest Olmec city, the formative period of the Olmecs, and the origin of their world. This was clearly an isolated high culture whose art styles and iconography was not influenced by any known ancient culture, containing pottery and ceramic styles consistent with the early pre-classic period. All the finds pointed towards the Olmecs being a culture that must have preceded all known high cultures of Mesoamerica. The relics of a lost chapter of time that no one knew existed, literally pushing back the age of ancient American civilization itself. Still, though, not all archaeologists were on board. The archaeologists who'd spent their entire career devoted to the Maya had had the origins of Mesoamerican civilization pulled out from under them, and they continued to criticize and belittle the work of Matthew Stirling's excavations and especially Marion Stirling's work on Stela C, which, if she were correct, would not only place the origins of Mesoamerican civilization in the Olmec realm, but also science, numerology, astronomy, and potentially even writing itself in the Olmec realm. This was a huge blow to Maya archaeology, and it's no surprise that opponents suggested her estimations about the missing half of the stela were completely wrong, suggesting that instead the other half of the broken stela will confirm that the Olmecs are a much younger civilization from around 400 AD or even after 1000 AD. When Mexican archaeologist and explorer Alfonso Zanil returned to continue the work at Tres Zapotes, the original Olmec city that the Stirlings had excavated all those years ago, he found the missing half of the stela. It was exactly what Marion predicted. She had been right all this time. Calculating and translating the dates resulted in precisely September 3rd, 32 BC. Irrefutable evidence that the Olmecs indeed had writing, numerology, dating, and probably astronomy before any other known civilization in Mesoamerica. There was no one left to argue. The Stirlings had found Mesoamerica's mother culture. Expedition IV, the final Olmec expedition, ended in late 1946. The Stirlings returned home to continue raising their family, and Matthew went back to his position as the director of the Smithsonian's Bureau of American Ethnology. But something was still puzzling Stirling. The original Olmec photo he'd seen in college, the same face that he saw so many times all across the Olmec world on nearly every single monument he excavated, the were-jaguar. Nowhere else in Mesoamerica's later cultures, the Maya, the Zapotecs, the Teotihuacanos, the Aztecs, the Toltecs, nowhere in these cultures had the were-jaguar ever been seen. Flipping through the data and photographs at the Smithsonian, Stirling had seen the were-jaguar in other places, in remote sites deep in the jungles of Central America, the jungles of Colombia and Ecuador, and high in the Andes of Peru. And so, like all great explorers whose souls are whipped on by the lure of adventure, Matthew Stirling, at 51 years old, returned to the wilds of ancient America. With a machete in hand, the 51-year-old explorer spent the rest of his career tracking down the path of the were-jaguar. From 1947 to 1953, he led 4 expeditions into the remote, dense wilds of Panama, tracking down evidence of were-jaguars and human-jaguar hybrids, looking to piece together the blank spot on the ancient map between the ancient civilizations of North and South America. He came across uncontacted tribes and documented their customs like he did with the tribes in Papua New Guinea. He discovered the oldest known ancient sites in Panama containing man-made mounds just like he'd seen among the Olmecs. He found artifacts of gold, pottery, stone tools, and stone weapons, and even depictions of the were-jaguar. In 1954, he led a short reconnaissance trip to Costa Rica, investigating ceramic artifacts that were clearly inspired or influenced by Mesoamerican artifacts. And in 1956 to 1957, he led his final expedition, returning to Ecuador where he'd studied the Jivaro tribes decades before in search of his were-jaguar. He discovered early pre-Columbian sites such as Tarqui, found deep in the jungled highlands of western Ecuador. Here, again, he discovered man-made earthen mounds like he'd seen among the Olmecs and in ancient Panama, as well as early period ceramic-style stone tools and stone weapons, and again, the were-jaguar. Since this final expedition in 1957, serious exploration and research into the origins of the were-jaguar and the greater world of the were-jaguar has been, well, virtually non-existent. And it's this amazing and almost completely unknown and certainly underappreciated story of the great explorer Matthew Stirling that makes me want to pick up the proverbial machete and continue this search for the were-jaguar. Ultimately, the Olmec's first explorers, Jose Maria, Frans Blom, and Matthew and Marion Stirling, completely rewrote ancient American history, showing the world what revealing, exploring, and excavating a truly lost ancient civilization looks like. But there are still many more unanswered questions about the Olmecs that future explorers will have to pick up the machete to find out. We still don't understand how the Olmecs transported their megalithic monuments, how they gained so much power in the ancient world. We have no evidence of what they they were trading in return for goods they received from around ancient Mesoamerica. We have no idea where the caves depicted in their monuments really are. We can't fully read their language, we don't fully understand their religion or iconography, and we have no explanation for how they appear on the archaeological timeline as a fully formed civilization with a sophisticated and iconic art style that should have at least taken centuries to develop. We don't know who the Olmec heads depict, whether they were kings, Mesoamerican ball players, or maybe both. And finally, we don't understand the cult of the were-jaguar. There are thousands of depictions of human-jaguar hybrids found throughout the Olmec realm, far more common than the colossal heads, and yet we barely understand it today. The Olmecs are the premier example of what a truly lost ancient civilization looks like. I'm Luke Caverns, thank you for joining me, and like and subscribe for more videos of exploration on the edges of the world.